The year is 1388. It is April 9th. A cold morning in the Swiss Alps, and dawn has barely touched the ridgeline above the valley of Glarus. 5,000 Habsburg soldiers fill a narrow mountain corridor. Armored knights sit tall on war horses bred for battle. Professional infantry march in disciplined ranks, boots crunching half-frozen ground in rhythmic unison. Crossbowmen keep pace behind them. Above the column, Austrian banners catch the gray morning light, the double eagle of empire, stiff with authority, snapping hard against the sky. This is the most powerful military force in Central Europe. It fills the valley floor like floodwater in a channel. And it moves with the heavy, inevitable confidence of men who believe the outcome was decided before they left home. They're wrong. Most of them will not live long enough to understand why. A sound splits the air above the ridgeline. Sharp. Dry. Unnatural, like a frozen lake cracking open, but amplified 100-fold by stone walls until it seems to come from the sky itself. Austrian soldiers look up. Some raise shields by instinct. Others freeze where they stand, because what they see defies everything they have ever known about how mountains behave. The entire western slope is detaching. Hundreds of tons of late winter snowpack, compacted, layered, dense as wet stone, loosened at the base before dawn by men with picks and wooden levers, begins to slide. The mass gathers speed. It channels through chutes that have been deliberately cleared of debris. It collects boulders as it descends, growing heavier and faster with each second. And it strikes the valley floor at the exact point where the Austrian vanguard is most compressed, where horses stand flank to flank and infantry have no room to turn their shoulders. Knights vanish beneath the white surge. War horses scream and twist sideways into bodies that cannot move. Infantry are hurled off their feet and slammed face first into frozen mud. Steel that cost a fortune to forge disappears under snow that cost nothing at all. And before a single Austrian officer can shout a command that makes any sense, crossbow bolts pour from the treeline, and farmers armed with halberds step out of the forest shadows and into the wreckage to finish what gravity started. This is the Battle of Näfels. A handful of Swiss militia, men who own no armor worth naming, who carry weapons that were farming tools the week before, who have never served under a general or trained inside a military garrison, destroy an Austrian army many times their size. Not through luck. Not through divine favor. Through a three-layered trap so precisely engineered that the mountain itself becomes the deadliest weapon on the field. Almost no one tells this story. You are about to hear all of it. Before we go any further, take a quick second. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from right now. If you know someone, a friend, a brother, a parent, anyone, who loves real history, the kind that never made it into the schoolbooks, send this to them. Hit the like button. It costs you nothing. But it helps this channel keep bringing these buried stories into the light. Now, back to the mountains. To understand why 5,000 armored men ride into a valley they will never ride out of, you need to understand the wound that sends them there. This catastrophe does not begin on April 9th. It begins 73 years earlier. And it begins with a humiliation so deep it reshapes an entire dynasty's understanding of what is dangerous. The year is 1315. A Habsburg army advances toward the pass at Morgarten, above the cold dark waters of Lake Ageri. The force is built around heavy cavalry, the supreme instrument of medieval warfare. Knights encased in full plate, trained from boyhood to fight on horseback, ride destriers that weigh more than 3 of the peasants they have been sent to punish. The path narrows between the lake and a steep, thickly forested slope. Officers see nothing to fear. The formation tightens. Confidence is total. It is misplaced. Swiss fighters are waiting above the defile. Not knights. Not mercenaries. Farmers. Cattle herders. Men whose hands know the heft of a splitting axe better than the balance of a knightly sword. At the chosen moment they roll logs down the slope. Boulders follow. The front of the column folds into itself. Led horses smash sideways into riders behind them. Steel screams against stone. The column jams, and then the Swiss come down the hillside at a full run. Halberds hook riders by the shoulder and rip them out of saddles. Hand axes find gaps between armor plates. Knights who have never once been unhorsed in tournament combat are dragged into the mud and killed beside a lake whose waters darken with blood before noon. It is not a battle. It is an education in what happens when heavy cavalry meets terrain it cannot control. And across Europe, the whispers do not stop for a generation. Then, 71 years later, it happens again. Sempak. 1386. Duke Leopold III of Austria, blood relative of the reigning Habsburg ruler, rides at the head of a magnificent host. His armor is the finest Austrian smiths can produce. His household guard flanks him in tight formation. He has come to end the Swiss rebellion permanently. To prove, once and for all, that defiance against noble authority ends only one way. He never delivers that proof. He is killed on the field. His banner, the visible symbol of his dynasty's right to rule, is trampled into summer grass beneath the boots of men who carry no coat of arms and own no family name worth recording. His personal guard, the best equipped soldiers Austrian silver can buy, are cut down around him by common fighters with reground blades and sweat-stained leather jerkins. 2 battles. 2 generations apart. The same result. And now, across every minor lordship, every restless guild hall, every ambitious town council from the Rhine to the Danube, the same question spreads through the political order like a crack through load-bearing stone. Can the Habsburgs be beaten? Not by rival princes with armies of their own. By shepherds. By woodcutters. By men who sleep on straw and eat black bread. For a feudal dynasty there is no wound more dangerous. Because feudal power does not rest on walls or garrisons alone. It rests on a belief. The belief that armored nobility is invincible, that common men cannot stand against mounted knights, that the order of the world is fixed and final. Shatter that belief, and every castle, every tax collection, every document stamped with an eagle seal becomes something held in place by habit instead of fear. Duke Albrecht III of Austria understands this calculation with the clarity of a man whose survival depends on it. He governs from Vienna with cold precision. He reads dispatches from his alpine territories. And one name keeps surfacing. Glarus. A small canton. A tight valley carved by the Linth River, where goat paths serve as roads and the sound of a church bell reaches from one end of the settlement to the other. In military terms, it is barely worth garrisoning. In political terms, it is the most dangerous place in the Habsburg world. Because Glarus is pulling away. Slowly. Quietly. With the stubborn patience of roots splitting rock apart. It has stopped answering Austrian summons with proper deference. It has sent representatives to the Swiss Confederation. It has started governing itself as though no Habsburg document has ever claimed authority over its people. And Albrecht sees exactly what this means. If Glarus defies the dynasty and survives, if it breaks free and there is no punishment, then every watching territory from the Tyrol to the Breisgau draws the same conclusion. Resistance works. And once that idea takes root, no amount of cavalry can dig it out. The equation leaves no room for patience. Glarus must be brought back. Not through messengers. Not through diplomacy. Through overwhelming, visible, undeniable force. In early 1388, sealed orders ride across Austrian lands. Levies are summoned from noble estates. Households furnish mounted knights, armed retainers, supply trains loaded with salt and grain and horseshoe iron. Farriers hammer at cold forges along the march routes. Armorers tighten rivets on brigandines and buff the great helms that turn men into faceless iron towers. The army that gathers is not the largest force in Christendom. But for its purpose, the crushing of one defiant valley, it is overwhelming. 5,000 men. Perhaps more. Heavy cavalry at the front. Infantry massed behind. Crossbowmen spread through the column. They form up and begin the long march toward the Alps. They are not merely soldiers. They are a dynasty's answer to a question it cannot afford to leave unanswered. Every banner, every polished helm, every warhorse stamping at half-frozen ground carries the same message. This ends now. But here is the part no Austrian commander considers as the columns push deeper into the mountains. Here is the detail that will turn confidence into chaos, armor into dead weight, and the finest cavalry in Central Europe into wreckage half buried under alpine snow. Those peasants in the valley below are not kneeling in their church, praying for rescue. They are building a machine. To understand the machine, you first need to understand the men who build it. And to understand the men, you need to let go of everything you think you know about Switzerland. In the late 1300s there is no Switzerland. Not as a country. No unified state. No parliament. No standing army. No capital city with vaulted halls and gold-sealed treaties. What exists is something far more fragile and far more dangerous to the established order. A loose collection of mountain communities bound together by a set of mutual agreements. They call themselves the Swiss Confederation. The principle behind it is simple. And in 14th century Europe, it is radical enough to get men killed. No outside ruler dictates how these communities live. Not the Habsburgs. Not the Holy Roman Emperor. Not any lord whose claim to authority rests on bloodline rather than consent. Each canton governs itself through open assembly, gatherings where a man who owns 40 head of cattle sits beside a man who owns 4, and both are granted the same voice. Leadership is chosen by the community, not inherited by birth. Disputes are resolved through negotiation, not by noble decree. And the binding force that holds the entire structure together is not a dynasty, not a throne, not a crown. It is a mutual promise, plain, unadorned, and deadly serious. If one of us is attacked, all of us respond. To the courts of Europe, this is not governance. It is disorder wrapped in stubbornness. Power is supposed to flow downward, from God to emperor, from emperor to duke, from duke to the peasants who work his fields and fill his levees. The Confederation inverts that order entirely. It says the people who freeze through the winters, who cut the timber, who drive the cattle across the high passes, they are the ones who decide. And that idea, more than any halberd or crossbow bolt, is what the Habsburgs are truly trying to destroy. Glarus sits inside this fragile alliance like a keystone in an arch. Pull it out, and the curve weakens. Hold it in place and the whole structure stands. The canton itself does not look like much to a man reading dispatches in a Viennese palace. A narrow valley. The Linth River carving a cold path through its center. Steep mountains pressing in from both sides until the sky shrinks to a strip of gray above the ridgeline. The valley floor is thin, barely wide enough in some places for a road, a row of stone houses, and a plowed field. The slopes above are high, bare rock and stunted pine and snow that clings well into April. Stand on the western ridge and look down. You can see nearly every rooftop, every planted row, every stretch of muddy track. It looks exposed. It looks defenseless. It looks like a place that 5,000 armored men could ride through in an afternoon and never look back. But that is what outsiders always think. And that is exactly why they keep dying in these valleys. Because the same geography that makes Glarus appear vulnerable also makes it a killing ground, if you know how to use it. And the people of Glarus have known how to use it for longer than any Habsburg has held a title. Near a place called Näfels, the valley narrows sharply. The Linth presses hard against the eastern slope, squeezing the passable ground into a corridor barely wide enough for horsemen to ride two abreast. On the opposite side, the western hillside rises steep and sudden above the path. In early April, it is still burdened with late-season snowpack. Not fresh powder. Dense, compacted layers, built over months of freezing nights and warming days, each cycle binding the mass tighter until it sits on the slope like a massive weight balanced on the edge of release. Heavy as stone. Stable enough to hold through winter. Unstable enough to fall, if the right pressure is applied at the right point at the right time. This is not something the defenders learn from a manual or a military treatise. It is something they know the way they know the sound of their own children's voices. The way they know which stream runs clean and which freezes first. The men who gather in the days before April 9th have walked these slopes since they could stand upright. They have watched avalanches release every spring, seen where the snow runs fastest, which natural chutes funnel debris downhill, how far the slide carries, what it buries beneath its weight. They have memorized the terrain not through study but through a lifetime of dependence on it. They know which snowfields sound hollow when struck with a pole, a sign of trapped air beneath, a weakness waiting to be exploited. They know which boulders perch at tipping points along the steeper drops. They know where a man can dig at the base of a compacted drift with controlled force, and where one careless strike sends everything crashing down before the moment is right. And now, as 5,000 Austrian soldiers march toward their homes, they are going to turn every piece of that knowledge into a weapon. The men who answer the call to defend Glarus are not soldiers. No Habsburg knight would look at them and see a fighting force worth respecting. They are farmers whose knuckles are split and scarred from winter plowing. Woodcutters whose forearms are thick as fence posts from years of splitting frozen pine. Blacksmiths who judge steel quality by the ring it makes on an anvil. Herdsmen who navigate passes through fog and ice that would kill an outsider inside an hour. Hunters who track chamois across frozen ridgelines by reading scuff marks invisible to any eye not trained by decades of necessity. Their equipment reflects their world. No matched plate armor. No colored surcoats bearing noble crests. leather jerkins patched and stiff with the salt of old sweat. Simple iron helmets, dented and dark from years of rough use. Halberds with shafts worn smooth by calloused grip, blades reground so many times the metal has thinned past its original profile. Spears with fire-hardened tips. A limited number of crossbows, accurate, maintained with care, but nothing close to the volume an Austrian column can deliver. Scattered among them, tools converted into arms. A billhook bent and filed into a hooking blade. A wood-splitting maul with a sharpened edge. A heavy pickaxe with a leather-wrapped shaft. These are working instruments. They will go back to work after, if there is an after. Now here is where the arithmetic becomes something you need to feel, not just hear. Because it is the foundation beneath everything that happens on April 9th. And it is terrifying. The total fighting strength of Glarus, every man who can hold a weapon, from the youngest boy strong enough to brace a spear shaft to the oldest grandfather still steady enough to swing, is somewhere between 600 and 1,000. The exact number is lost. But the range is not. Even at the most generous count, these defenders are outnumbered 5 to 1. At a more realistic estimate, the disparity approaches 8 to 1. On the Austrian side, 5,000 professionals. Armored cavalry capable of shattering an infantry line on open ground with a single charge. Trained crossbowmen delivering massed volleys on command. Officers who have studied the discipline of war since childhood. Supply wagons, logistics, coordination. Every advantage that wealth and feudal organization can provide. On flat, open ground, this is not a contest. It is over before it starts. But here is the detail the Habsburgs never consider. The detail that turns this entire campaign upside down. The detail that military thinkers will still study 6 centuries later when they examine what happened in this valley. The ground is not flat. The ground is not open. And the men of Glarus know every fold, every ridge, every weakness in it. In the days before the Austrian column reaches the valley, the leaders of Glarus study the terrain near Näfels with the focus of men whose families will die if they get a single calculation wrong. These are communal captains. Men whose names history has mostly lost, because they never cared about fame. They cared about their children surviving the week. They walk the narrowing corridor step by step. They know choke points, angles of fire from the treeline. The low rise where a retreating force could stop, turn, and hold. They pace distances between landmarks, a distinctive boulder, a bent tree, a curve in the river, so that when battle comes, a crossbowman can tell the instant his target enters killing range without needing to think about it. They pool their knowledge the way they pool labor during harvest season. One man knows where the snowpack sits deepest. Another knows which rock chutes funnel debris most effectively downhill. A third has studied crossbow angles from elevated positions along the forest edge. A fourth survived the slaughter at Sempak 2 years earlier and knows from first-hand experience what happens to heavy cavalry when its forward momentum collapses. No single mind designs what comes next. The plan is collective, assembled piece by men who have never had the luxury of solving problems alone. Men who understand, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that in this valley cooperation is not a virtue. It is the only reason anyone is still alive. What they design has 3 layers. 3 nested circles of preparation, each one invisible from the valley floor, each one dependent on the others. And the Austrians are going to ride straight into the center of all 3 without ever seeing the edges close behind them. But here is what separates Näfels from a simple ambush. What makes it something far more dangerous, and far more fragile, than a hidden position and a surprise attack. If the first layer fails, the second becomes useless. If the second misfires, the third faces 5,000 armored men in direct combat with no advantage and nowhere to run. The margin for error is not thin. It does not exist. One mistake, a single miscalculation, a single moment of panic, a single wrong strike of a pick on a frozen slope, and everyone in that valley dies. And every man standing in the cold on the night of April 8th knows it. The first layer is the most dangerous, not because of what it requires physically, because of what it requires mentally. A small group of fighters, perhaps 50, perhaps 60, no more, receive their instructions on the evening of April 8th. Their role is deceptively simple to describe and nearly impossible to perform. At dawn, they will position themselves near the approach to Näfels, visible, exposed, alone. When the Austrian vanguard arrives, thousands of armored cavalry and infantry pressing forward with the full momentum of imperial authority, These 50 men will make contact. They will exchange bolts. They will jab with halberds. They will resist just long enough to appear genuine. And then they will retreat. Not run. Not break. Not scatter into the trees. Retreat. Step by measured step. Controlled. Deliberate. Drawing the entire Austrian column deeper into the narrowing throat of the valley. Pulling 5,000 men forward by making 5,000 men believe they are chasing something weak. The performance has to be perfect. Every second of it. Too fast and the Austrians will sense a trap. A commander will raise a hand. The column will halt. Scouts will check the slopes. And every Swiss fighter on the mountain will be exposed before the jaws can close. Too slow and the lure unit dies where it stands, overrun by cavalry that covers ground faster than a man on foot can yield it. There is no middle ground. There is no rehearsal that can replicate the pressure of standing in the path of 5,000 men and choosing, with each heartbeat, to take one more step backward instead of turning to run. In the hours before nightfall, the men of the lure unit walk the ground backward. Again. Again. They memorize the placement of every stone that could catch a heel. Every root that could trip a man moving in reverse. Every dip and rise in the terrain that changes footing. They walk it until their legs carry the knowledge without input from their minds. Because tomorrow, their minds will be occupied with the sound of hooves and the sight of lowered lances. And their legs will need to move on their own. No one envies their assignment. But no one refuses it either. The second layer begins long before the sun rises. While the lure unit rests, or tries to, a separate group climbs the western slopes above Näfels in near total darkness. These are the slope teams. 12 men. Maybe 15. They carry picks, wooden poles, iron levers and coils of rope. They wear no armor. Wait on a steep, icy incline at 4 in the morning is not protection. It is a death sentence. One slip, one loose foothold, and a man drops 30 feet onto frozen rock in silence, because making noise is not permitted. Nothing is permitted except controlled movement upward, breath by careful breath, until they reach the snow deposits they marked days earlier. The work begins in the dark. It is slow, methodical, terrifying in its precision. A man drives a pole vertically into the snowpack. He listens. If the sound comes back solid, a dull thud with no resonance, the snow is bonded to the layer beneath it. Stable. Dangerous to disturb because it may not release cleanly. But if the pole returns a hollow note, a faint echo that says there is air trapped between layers, a void where the bond between old snow and new has weakened, that is the spot. That is where a controlled excavation at the base can undermine the entire slab above. They dig with picks. Short, careful strokes. Each one measured against the possibility that the next swing breaks through the remaining support and sends everything downhill 12 hours too early. One man braces a wooden lever beneath a boulder perched at a natural tipping point. He does not push it. He positions the lever so that when the moment comes, when the horn sounds, a single thrust will send 2,000 pounds of granite rolling into the chute below. Another team clears a natural gully that runs down the steepest section of the slope. Dead branches, loose debris, anything that might slow or deflect a sliding mass. They need the snow to travel fast and hit the valley floor heavy. Every obstruction removed adds velocity. Every cleared foot of channel adds force at the bottom. One wrong step, one careless swing, one man losing his balance on an icy ledge in the dark, and the trap fires before the target is in position. There is no second chance. There is no reserve plan. If the snow falls too early, the lure unit is still retreating through open ground with the full Austrian army behind them and nothing between them and death but a prayer. These men worked for hours. Hands numb. Fingers cramping around tool handles that frost has turned slick. Breath rising in short white bursts they try to suppress because sound carries in cold air and the Austrian column is already forming at the far end of the valley. They finish their work in the gray half-light before dawn. Then they descend to the treeline, pick up crossbows and halberds, and take their positions among the flanking fighters who will strike once the avalanche has done its work. They do not rest. There is no time. The third layer waits below. In the narrowest section of the Näfels corridor, where the Linth squeezes the passable ground to its thinnest, halberdiers stand in tight defensive blocks. Shoulder pressed against shoulder. Weapon shafts braced at a 45-degree angle against the earth behind them. The spacing is precise. Close enough that no mounted rider can force through the gaps. wide enough that each man can swing his halberd in a controlled arc without hooking his neighbor's shaft or catching his own blade on the man beside him. They are not here to charge. They are here to hold. Their job is to become a wall, a human barrier of sharpened steel and braced wood that catches the Austrian vanguard after the snow has shattered its formation. They will absorb whatever comes through the avalanche zone. They will absorb whatever cavalry is still mounted, still coherent, still swinging. And they will not give ground. Not one step. Behind them and to the flanks, crossbowmen settle into positions along the treeline and behind natural rock cover. They are slightly elevated, not by much, a few feet at most, but enough to fire over the halberd line and into the compressed mass of Austrians the plan is designed to create. They have measured their distances. A flat-topped boulder 40 yards downrange. A lightning-scarred pine at 60. The point where the river bends sharply east at 80. When a target crosses one of those marks, the crossbowman does not need to estimate range. He does not need to adjust. He pulls the lever. The bolt flies. The distance has already been solved. Every element is connected. Every layer depends on the one before it. The lure draws the Austrians deep. The slope buries the front of the column. The killing floor catches everything that survives. Remove any single piece and the structure collapses. But there is one element no preparation can guarantee. One variable no amount of terrain knowledge or nighttime labor can control. Timing. 2 signals. That is the entire communication system binding 1,000 men across 3 layers of ambush spread over a quarter mile of mountain terrain. A single horn blast from the slope means the teams above are in position. Ready. The snow is undermined. The boulders are levered. The chutes are clear. A second horn blast, triggered only when the lure unit has drawn the Austrian vanguard into the compression zone, means release. Between those 2 sounds there is nothing. No adjustment. No update. No fallback signal for something went wrong. Silence and faith. That is what holds the trap together. Faith that the lure unit will hold its nerve. Faith that the slope teams finish their work correctly. Faith that the halberdiers will not break when 5,000 men come crashing toward them through a wall of snow and debris. And here is the part that separates Näfels from every comfortable story about courageous underdogs you have ever heard. These men are not confident. They are not filled with righteous fire. They are scared. Every one of them. The farmer bracing his halberd in the killing floor thinks about his sons asleep 2 miles down the valley. The woodcutter crouched in the treeline with a crossbow thinks about the field he was supposed to plant this week. The hunter on the slope, wiping frozen mud from his pick handle, thinks about the very real possibility that he has miscalculated the fracture point, that the snow will not slide when the horn sounds, and that the men below will face the full Austrian army in open combat with no advantage except courage, which will not be enough. Nobody speaks. Orders were given hours ago. Final checks completed. Positions confirmed. There is nothing left to say. Some men pray. Quiet words. Eyes closed. And still. Some touch the edges of blades that are already as sharp as they will ever be, a nervous habit, not a useful one. Some look up at the ridgeline where the sky is just beginning to separate from the stone and think about whether this is the last time they will see it brighten. Then dawn arrives. Cold. Gray. A thin mist lifts from the surface of the lymph. The valley fills with a silence so heavy it has texture. Not peace, not calm, but the drawn breath stillness that precedes violence. Every sound carries. A bird startles from the treeline and 3 men flinch. From the north end of the valley, a new sound reaches them. Low at first, then growing. The rhythmic, unmistakable grind of an army in motion. Thousands of boots. Hundreds of hooves. The metallic percussion of armor shifting with each stride. The sharp bark of an officer correcting formation. The creak of leather. The snort of war horses catching unfamiliar scent on the air. The Austrian column enters the valley of Glarus in textbook order. Armored cavalry at the front. Lances upright. Visors raised, they do not expect contact yet. Infantry massed behind in disciplined ranks. Crossbowmen interspersed at regular intervals. Banners held high, fabric stiff with cold, the double eagle of Habsburg authority visible against the gray-green slopes from half a mile away. They fill the valley floor. They move with the steady, unhurried pace of men who believe the most important decision of the day has already been made, the decision to come here at all. Everything else is formality. A defiant canton. A brief show of force. A submission. A march home. In the treeline, a crossbowman watches the lead riders past the lightning-scarred pine. His bolt is seated. His hands are still. On the slope, a man rests his palm flat against the handle of a lever wedged beneath 2,000 pounds of granite. He does not push. Not yet. In the killing floor, a halberdier feels the man beside him shift his weight. Neither speaks. Neither needs to. And at the front of it all, visible and exposed and utterly alone, the lure unit steps into the open. The trap is set. The Austrian column is moving. The first horn has not yet sounded. Everything now depends on whether 5,000 armored men do exactly what their arrogance tells them to do. They do. The Swiss forward unit appears near the approach to Näfels looking exactly as intended. Small. Scattered. A ragged cluster of men in dull leather and iron, standing in the path of a column that outnumbers them 100 to 1. A few crossbow bolts fly toward the Austrian vanguard, most fall short or glance off raised shields. A halberd jabs at the leading rider and is batted aside with a mailed fist. The Swiss line buckles. Steps back. Steps back again. From the Austrian perspective, this is confirmation. Everything they expected. Mountain peasants with enough courage to show themselves but nowhere near enough strength to stand. The vanguard presses forward. Lances lower from upright carry to attack angle. Horses shift from a walk into a faster stride. Officers do not call for caution. Why would they? The enemy is retreating. And the enemy keeps retreating. Step by step. Exactly as rehearsed. Over ground their feet know by memory. Past the flat-topped boulder. Past the bend in the river. Deeper into the corridor where the walls close in and the Linth steals the ground from beneath the eastern flank. The lure unit absorbs the pressure without breaking. A man at the rear of the group takes a crossbow bolt in the thigh and stumbles. The fighter beside him grabs his arm and keeps him moving. They cannot stop. They cannot slow. Every step backward is another 10 yards of Austrian column drawn deeper into the narrowing throat. Behind the vanguard, the rest of the army follows. The formation compresses. Horses that rode 3 abreast squeeze to 2. Infantry tighten into a dense mass. Shields press against the backs of men in front. Crossbowmen lose their firing lanes behind a wall of friendly bodies. The column is no longer a formation. It is a crowd, packed, committed, and moving forward because the men behind are pushing and the men in front see nothing that tells them to stop. The Swiss forward unit crests a low rise near the base of the western slope. They stop retreating. It is not sudden. Not dramatic. They slow. They plant their feet. They turn. Halberds come level, blades angled forward, shafts braced against hips and the frozen earth behind their heels. 50 men. Facing 5,000. No longer moving. The Austrian vanguard commits. Momentum carries them forward. The distance closes to 40 yards. 30. 20. Lances drop to killing angle. The first riders spur their mounts into a canter. From the western slope, a horn sounds. A single clear note that bounces between the rock walls and reaches every ear in the valley. For one breath, one held, silent, infinite breath, nothing happens. Then the mountain answers. The crack comes first. A sound unlike anything on a battlefield. Not the clash of steel. Not the snap of a bowstring. A deep, percussive fracture. The sound of 1,000,000 pounds of compacted snow and ice separating from the slope it has clung to all winter. It begins at the excavation points. The undermined bases give way. Fracture lines race through the channels the slope teams cut in the dark hours before dawn. The slab tilts, and falls. The slide hits the cleared chutes and accelerates. Rock joins it. The boulders levered free from their perches roll into the moving mass and are swallowed, carried, turned into projectiles inside a white current that gains speed with every foot of descent. The sound builds from a crack to a roar, a low, grinding thunder that fills the valley from wall to wall and drowns every human voice beneath it. It strikes the valley floor at the point of maximum Austrian compression. The effect is not gradual. It is instant and absolute. War horses, 1,500 pounds of trained muscle and bone, are swept sideways and buried. One knight is there, sword raised, visor down, balanced in the stirrups, and then he is not. He is gone. Replaced by churning white. Another mount rears in terror and comes down on a foot soldier who never sees it. Infantry at the center of the impact zone are knocked flat and pinned beneath weight they cannot shift. Men at the edges are struck by boulders moving at the speed of a galloping horse. A single impact caves in a breastplate like a fist through wet parchment. Armor does nothing. Shields do nothing. Training does nothing. Physics does not negotiate. The solid ground beneath the column ceases to exist. Snow mixes with mud in an instant, turning the valley floor into a sucking gray slurry that grabs at hooves and boots and pulls men off balance with every step. Visibility collapses. Dust and ice crystals fill the air. Men who were standing upright 3 seconds ago are crawling on hands and knees, choking, spitting grit, reaching for weapons that have been knocked beyond arm's length. And before a single Austrian officer draws enough breath to shout a coherent order, the bolts arrive. From the tree-line, from behind the rocks, from every elevated position marked and measured in the days of preparation. Iron-tipped crossbow bolts drive into the staggering, compressed, half-buried mass of Austrian soldiers with the precision of men shooting at distances they already know. There is no guesswork. The flat-topped boulder, the scarred pine, the river bend, ranges solved before the battle started. The crossbowmen pull their levers and reload and pull again. They target officers first. If you want to stop an army from recovering, you do not shoot the man holding a sword. You shoot the man holding a plan. The captain with his mouth open, shouting something, a bolt takes him through the gap where gorget meets the collar of his breastplate. He drops mid-word. The knight pointing toward the slope, trying to direct a response. A bolt strikes his raised forearm and pins it to the wooden shield he carries. He staggers sideways and disappears beneath a riderless horse. A bannerman, the man whose only job is to hold the standard high enough for every soldier to see and follow, takes a bolt through the shoulder. The banner dips, tilts, falls into churned snow and vanishes beneath a boot. And with it falls the last visible symbol of command in the Austrian vanguard. If you are still watching right now, hit that like button. Because what happens next is the part that history books leave out. And you deserve to hear it. The Swiss halberdiers move. Not as a charge. There is no room for a charge and no need for one. They step forward, shoulder to shoulder. A wall of sharpened steel advancing into the shattered front edge of the Austrian column with the steady mechanical rhythm of men doing necessary work. Halberds reach forward and hook armored riders who are struggling to remount, catching the lip of a shoulder plate, the rim of a helm, the crook of an elbow, and dragging them sideways out of saddles onto ground that is no longer solid enough to stand on. Spears punch into the articulation points of plate armor. The armpit, the inner thigh, the narrow eye slot of a visor. Short-hafted axes crack down onto helmets with force enough to buckle steel and break the skull beneath it. The Austrians at the very front are no longer an army. They are individuals, separated by snow and debris and dead horses, fighting alone, dying alone. But armies do not die all at once, and the Austrians are not cowards. One night, still mounted, still coherent, still burning with the training that says a mounted charge can break anything, gathers roughly 20 riders from the chaos. Horses bleeding, men dazed, but upright, moving. He drives them forward into a Swiss halberd block that has advanced slightly too far beyond the killing floor. The impact is savage. 2 halberdiers go down instantly. One takes a sword across the shoulder that bites through leather into bone. He falls sideways and does not rise. The other is struck by a horse's chest at close to full stride. The weight differential is catastrophic. He is thrown backward and hits the ground so hard his helmet rings against a rock beneath the mud. A comrade grabs his collar and drags him clear before hooves finish what the impact started. A halberd shaft snaps under a downward sword blow. The severed blade spins into the snow. For one terrible elongated minute, Austrian steel cuts into Swiss bodies from above. Every advantage of height, weight, reach, and professional training compressed into 60 seconds of brutal mounted combat. This is the closest the Habsburgs come to reversing the entire battle. But the ground will not allow it. A warhorse mid-stride plants its front legs into snow-covered mud that looks solid and is not. The hooves plunge through. The horse pitches forward. Its rider, 70 pounds of plate armor with no way to catch himself, flies over the animal's neck and lands face first on frozen earth. He does not get up before a halberd finds the gap between his helm and gorget. Another horse slips sideways on debris hidden beneath the churned surface and crashes into the mount beside it. Both riders go down in a tangle of reins and thrashing iron-shod hooves. The Swiss second line steps in without hesitation, without fear, without mercy. Hooks catch shoulder plates and wrench them aside. A short axe finds the weakened hinge of a visor and splits it open. The knight behind the visor stops moving. The countercharge, the last organized Austrian offensive action of the day, breaks apart into scattered individual struggles. Men fighting on their own. Men fighting to survive, not to win. And behind the shattered vanguard, the disaster multiplies. The rear of the Austrian column is still pressing forward. Officers in the middle ranks cannot see the front. They hear noise, the crash of steel, the screaming of horses, the deep residual rumble of settling snow, but sound in a mountain valley is a liar. It bounces off stone walls. It arrives from the wrong direction. It multiplies until a man cannot tell whether the fighting is 50 yards ahead or behind him. They interpret the forward movement of the men in front of them as progress. They push their soldiers deeper into the corridor, adding body after body to a front line that no longer exists as a coherent structure. The compression becomes lethal on its own. Men who want to fight cannot raise their sword arms because other men's shoulders are pressed against their elbows. Men who want to retreat cannot turn around because the ranks behind them are still moving forward. Men who have fallen, struck by bolts, knocked down by panicked horses, simply tripped on hidden debris, cannot rise because other men are standing on them. The column is no longer a military formation. It is a crowd crush sealed inside a stone corridor with sharpened steel closing from the front. An Austrian banner near the center of the column tilts, then drops. Its bearer has been knocked flat, or has let it fall deliberately because holding a banner makes you a target and targets are dying fast. In medieval warfare, a fallen standard is not a piece of cloth on the ground. It is the visible death of command authority. Every soldier who sees it understands the same truth at the same moment, the way a congregation understands the meaning of a church bell tolling at the wrong hour. This battle is lost. A few captains still try. They drag infantry into tight defensive clusters, shields locked outward, spears braced, the desperate hedgehog formation of men who know they are surrounded and whose only hope is to hold long enough for something to change. These knots of resistance absorb Swiss pressure for minutes, sometimes longer. The soldiers inside them fight with a stubborn professionalism that does not vanish simply because strategy has abandoned them. But the Swiss do not need to break these clusters. They flow around them, pressure the edges, pick off men whose shields drift open, wait for exhaustion and thirst and the slow leaking of morale to do the work that halberds cannot. Time is on the defenders' side now. Every minute that passes, the Austrian army grows weaker. Every minute, the Swiss position grows stronger. And somewhere in the compressed mass of the Austrian column, somewhere between the buried vanguard and the still advancing rear, the retreat begins. Not as an order, not as a decision, as a feeling. A soldier at the back of the formation sees wounded men stumbling toward him. Not reinforcements rotating out. Broken men. Men whose eyes carry the specific emptiness of someone who has watched structure collapse around them. He takes a step backward. The man beside him sees the step and matches it. The man behind them turns his body sideways, not fully retreating, not yet, just opening the angle toward escape. And that is all it takes. Because retreat, once it starts, feeds on itself faster than any officer can contain it. The army that entered this valley to deliver a message is about to receive one instead. The retreat does not begin with a command. It begins with a sound. The sound of shields being dropped. Metal hitting mud. Then another. Then a dozen at once. A ragged percussion that carries through the valley like a second avalanche, except this one is made of morale instead of snow. Austrian soldiers near the rear of the column, the ones who still have room to move, who have not yet been drawn into the compressed killing ground, begin pulling away. They walk at first. Controlled steps. Eyes over their shoulders. Weapons still raised. The training holds for 10 yards. Maybe 20. Then it breaks. A man runs. One man. And that is enough. The soldier beside him sees the movement and matches it. The one behind them drops his crossbow and follows. Running spreads backward through the column the way fire spreads through dry timber, not gradually, not in stages, but in a single consuming rush that overtakes discipline and rank and every oath sworn to the House of Habsburg before the march began. Officers shout for order. Their voices disappear into the noise. There is too much of it now. Steel clattering against stone. Horses screaming. Men cursing in dialects that no longer matter because every language sounds the same when the word is run. And now the armor turns. The beautiful, expensive, painstakingly forged plate armor that marks these men as the elite of Austrian military power, the steel that separates a knight from a peasant the way a castle wall separates a lord from the dirt, becomes the thing that kills them. A man in full plate cannot run. Not truly. He can lumber. He can stagger. He can gasp for breath inside a helm that has become a sealed iron box with no ventilation and no way to wipe the sweat and blood from his eyes. He can stumble over a fallen comrade and go down hard and lie there on his back like an overturned beetle, arms flailing, fingers scrabbling at frozen ground, while the straps and buckles that hold his protection in place hold him pinned to the earth instead. Some try to cross the Linth. Desperate men making desperate calculations. The river is not wide, but the current is fed by snowmelt, fast, brutally cold, and completely indifferent to rank. A knight in 60 pounds of plate steps into water that reaches his waist and feels the river take his legs out from under him. The weight does the rest. He goes under. He does not come up. His armor, his status, his identity, his inheritance, pulls him to the bottom of a river that will carry his body downstream and deposit it among the rocks like any other piece of debris. Others simply stop. They plant their weapons point down in the mud. They kneel. They remove their helms and look up at the Swiss fighters advancing toward them with the particular stillness of men who have made their final decision and are waiting to learn whether it will be met with mercy or steel. The Swiss advance. But they do not chase. They do not scatter into the valley in wild pursuit. They move forward in the same tight blocks that held the killing floor, step by step, halberd by halberd, clearing the ground they designed this entire battle to defend. Small groups peel off toward the flanks and strike at isolated Austrian clusters still attempting to regroup. Not enough force to overextend. Not enough aggression to break their own formation. Just enough pressure to keep the fear alive. Just enough to make sure the retreat does not slow, does not stabilize, does not turn back into resistance. They understand something that most victorious armies throughout history forget in the heat of the moment. Victory does not require annihilation. It requires dominance. And dominance means knowing when to stop. By early afternoon, the valley falls silent. The Austrian army exits Glarus in fragments. Units separated from each other. Banners gone. Officers dead or missing. Horses limping riderless along paths they were led down that morning by men who no longer breathe. The force that entered as a message written in steel leaves as a confession written in blood. Hundreds of Habsburg soldiers lie in the valley behind them. Some buried beneath snow that is already beginning to soften under the April sun. White stained in widening halos of red that spread like slow ink across the surface. Some crumpled in the narrow corridor where the fighting was thickest, armor dented and pierced, faces turned toward a sky they will never see again. Some drifting in the Linth, carried gently by the current, turning slowly in the shallows as though the river wants no part in what happened on its banks. Swiss losses are real. Do not let the scale of the victory erase that truth. Farmers lie among the dead. Fathers. Men from the Lure unit who absorbed the first shock of Austrian cavalry and held their nerve until the trap closed. Men from the halberd blocks who took sword cuts that leather could not stop. Men who climbed the slopes before dawn with picks and poles and numb fingers, and came down to fight, and did not climb back up. A herdsman who tracked chamois across frozen ridgelines for 30 years bleeds out beside a river he drank from as a boy. A woodcutter who swung his axe into Austrian plate the way he swung it into frozen pine lies still, one hand still wrapped around the shaft. The victory is not free. It never is. But it is final. There are no celebrations that evening. The men of Glarus are too hollowed out for triumph. Too aware of the margin. Too busy carrying dead friends to homes where wives will answer the door and already know. They tend wounds with boiled water and strips of linen. They collect Austrian weapons, not as trophies but as tools. Good steel is good steel. Tomorrow it will be reshaped, repurposed, put to use in the same forges and workshops that built the halberds that broke an empire's pride. The House of Habsburg does not return to Glarus. Not that season. Not the next. Not ever. The cost is too visible. The lesson too clear. The risk of a fourth mountain humiliation too fatal for a dynasty that holds power through the perception of invincibility. In time, Glarus is formally recognized as a member of the Swiss Confederation. Not as a rebellious territory grudgingly tolerated. As a sovereign canton whose independence is acknowledged in writing by the same dynasty that tried to erase it. The Confederation grows. Not through conquest. Through endurance. Through the proof, delivered 3 times in 70 years at Morgarten, at Sempak, at Näfels. that a union of small communities bound by mutual promise can stand against the full armored weight of feudal empire and refuse to break. And here is the hidden truth that outlasts the battle itself. The truth the Habsburgs never wanted spoken aloud. The truth that still matters 6 centuries later, wherever ordinary people stand against power that considers them beneath notice. Näfels was not won by a general. It was not won by a hero. It was won by men who knew their valley better than the men who claimed to own it. Men who turned snow into a weapon, gravity into an ally, patience into a killing force. Men who understood that you do not need to match your enemy's strength. You need to choose the ground where his strength becomes meaningless. The snow melts. The Linth runs clear. Fields are planted in soil that holds iron fragments and bone just beneath the surface. Children grow up in houses that are still standing because their fathers climbed a frozen slope in the dark, with numb hands and terrified hearts, and trusted each other enough to hold a line they had no right to hold. If this story stayed with you, if you believe these buried moments deserve to be heard, subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because these are the stories that time tried to silence. And silence is how history dies. The mountains settle back into their ancient stillness. Stone and ice and wind. They have watched empires rise. They have watched empires fall. They keep the truth of Näfels in their bedrock. Patient, permanent, waiting to teach it again, to anyone arrogant enough to forget. This was Dark History Exhumed, where the past still bleeds.